In the winter of 1921, a demolition foreman walks through Hamilton Palace with a lantern and a notebook, counting cracks like debts. The air smells of damp plaster and cold soot. Under his boots, the floor has begun to dip, as if the house is slowly exhaling into the ground. This was once the greatest private palace in Britain, stuffed with masterpieces and gold leaf, built to outshine kings. But the Duke's estate needed cash, and coal was the quickest answer. So the seams were chased beneath the foundations until the walls started to move. How does a palace die from the inside out? A palace built to humiliate rivals. The Hamiltons did not want a big house. They wanted a building that could end arguments before they started. When you approached Hamilton Palace from the South Road in the middle of the 19th century, you saw it from 2 miles away. The facade stretched 426 feet across the Lanarkshire skyline, longer than the entire length of Buckingham Palace's garden front. It had a central block crowned with a dome, flanked by wings that seemed to march toward the horizon. The stone was pale, almost white in summer light, and it caught the sun like a dare. This was not architecture. This was a weapon. The palace sat 10 miles southeast of Glasgow, on land the Hamiltons had held since the 1400s. By the time the main structure reached its final form in the 1840s, it had become the largest non-royal residence in Britain. Not the most beautiful, not the most tasteful, the largest. The point was never subtlety. The point was that when a rival aristocrat mentioned his country seat, Eke Hamilton could smile and say nothing because the building did the talking. Inside, the scale turned suffocating. The entrance hall rose 60 feet to a painted ceiling, supported by columns of polished marble shipped from Italy. Light fell through high windows onto floors inlaid with rare woods, geometric patterns that took craftsmen months to complete. Every surface had been worked, carved, gilded, or painted. The message was simple. This family did not need to work. They could afford to hire hundreds of people whose only job was to make a house look like heaven. The state apartments occupied the entire south front, drawing rooms the size of tennis courts. Libraries where the shelves climbed 3 stories high, requiring spiral staircases just to reach the upper volumes. A dining room that could seat 60 without feeling crowded, where the plasterwork overhead depicted gods and heroes in such detail that guests would crane their necks until the soup arrived. The Hamiltons collected art like other families collected debts. Paintings by Rubens, Van Dyck, and Titian lined the walls. Classical sculptures stood in niches like frozen centuries. There were cabinets filled with porcelain that cost more than a laborer earned in a lifetime. But here is the thing about a palace. It does not care if you go bankrupt. It still needs heating. By the 1830s, the estate employed over 200 people just to keep the palace operational. Gardeners, grooms, footmen, housemaids, kitchen staff, laundry maids, a small army whose wages came due every month whether the crop succeeded or not. The coal fires had to be lit in 40 rooms every morning during winter, and starting at 5 o'clock, so that by the time the family descended for breakfast, the cold had been driven out. The windows had to be cleaned by men on ladders, working section by section across a facade that never seemed to end. The chandeliers had to be lowered, every crystal wiped, then hoisted back into place. It took a week. The 10th Duke of Hamilton, Alexander, understood what he had inherited, a monument that demanded constant feeding. He had married a princess, a granddaughter of King William IV, and the palace was meant to reflect that status. So he kept expanding. a new picture gallery in 1832, stretching 230 feet in a single unbroken line, designed to house the family's growing art collection. More guest suites. A private chapel with stained glass that cost as much as a small manor house. Each addition made the palace more impressive. Each addition made it hungrier. Fashion moved faster than architecture. By the 1850s, the London elite had started building smaller, more comfortable country houses. They wanted informality, shooting lodges, seaside villas where you did not need 6 servants just to get dressed in the morning. Hamilton Palace belonged to an older logic, the idea that power meant visibility, that a duke's worth could be measured in square footage and ceiling height. The family kept maintaining it as if that logic still held. It did not. The estate's income came from land rents, coal royalties, and investments. Some years were strong. Other years, agricultural depression hit and tenant farmers could not pay. But the palace did not adjust. It sat there, stone and glass and gold leaf, requiring the same care whether the accounts balanced or not. The staff could not be dismissed without scandal. The rooms could not be left unheated without risking damp and decay. The art had to be insured. The roof had to be maintained. A palace is not a possession. It is a commitment. By the 1870s, the 12th Duke found himself managing an inheritance that had started to feel like a trap. The palace looked magnificent. Visitors gasped when they entered the Great Hall. But behind the scenes, the numbers had begun their slow, grinding work. Maintenance costs outpaced rental income. Investments did not always perform. The family lived well, very well, but the margin between splendor and crisis grew thinner each year. What does it cost to keep a monument alive when fashion moves on? The Hamiltons were about to find out, not all at once, not in a single catastrophic crash, but slowly, the way a palace dies. One decision at a time, the rooms that ate money alive. Every new gallery and library looked like culture, but each one added another permanent mouth to feed. The picture gallery was the turning point, though nobody called it that at the time. Completed in 1832, it was designed by the architect David Hamilton, no relation to the family, and it became one of the longest single rooms in any British private house. 230 feet of uninterrupted space, lit by skylights and tall windows, lined floor to ceiling with paintings in heavy gilt frames. The room was a temple to taste, a place where the 10th Duke could walk his guests through centuries of European art and watch their expressions shift from politeness to genuine awe. But a painting does not just hang there. It requires temperature control, or the varnish cracks. It requires trained staff to clean the frames without damaging the gold leaf. It requires insurance, because a single Rubens could be worth more than a working farm. The gallery did not generate income. It consumed it steadily, year after year, a beautiful mouth that never stopped eating. The same logic applied to every expansion. The family added a conservatory in the 1840s, a soaring glass structure filled with exotic plants imported from across the empire. Palm trees, orchids, ferns from South America that required constant misting and warmth. A dedicated team of gardeners worked full-time to keep the collection alive. The conservatory was spectacular. It was also a furnace of expense, burning coal and money in equal measure to maintain a climate that did not exist naturally in Lanarkshire. Then came the chapel. Then came new state bedrooms. Each project justified itself in the language of dignity and tradition. A duke had obligations. He had to receive royalty if they visited. He had to host political gatherings, shooting parties, balls where the aristocracy renewed alliances and brokered marriages. The palace was not a luxury, it was a tool of statecraft. At least, that is what the family told themselves. The household accounts reveal a different story. By the 1860s, Hamilton Palace required an annual budget of roughly £12,000 just for operations. That covered wages, coal, candles, oil for lamps, repairs to masonry, replacement of worn carpets, restocking the wine cellar, feeding the horses, maintaining the carriages, and 100 other categories that never stopped ticking over. £12,000 in the 1860s translates to approximately £1.4 million in modern value every year, just to keep the doors open. Where did that money come from? The estate's coal royalties provided a significant share. Lanarkshire sat on rich seams of coal, and the Hamiltons had leased mineral rights to mining companies across their lands. The companies dug, the coal sold, and the Duke received a percentage. It was passive income, the kind that arrived whether you worked for it or not. But it was also unpredictable. When demand surged, royalties surged. When markets slumped, they fell. A palace built on coal royalties is a palace built on a gamble. The other income sources were steadier, but slower. Agricultural rents from tenant farms, dividends from railway investments, income from urban properties in Glasgow. The 12th Duke, William Alexander Louis Stephen, who inherited in 1863 at the age of 20, tried to manage the estate like a business. He reviewed the accounts. He questioned expenditures. He understood, intellectually, that Hamilton Palace was bleeding money faster than the land could replenish it. But understanding a problem is not the same as solving it, because solving it would mean admitting that the palace itself was the problem. And that was unthinkable. The palace was the family's identity. It was proof that the Hamiltons mattered, that they belonged in the same conversation as royalty. To scale back, to close wings, to dismiss staff and live modestly would be to admit defeat. Aristocratic pride does not bend easily. It tends to snap. So the Duke tried smaller measures, delayed maintenance on outbuildings, reduced the number of formal entertainments, sold some of the less important paintings, quietly, through dealers who did not ask loud questions. It helped for a while. But a palace does not slow down. The roof still aged. The stonework still cracked in winter frost. The paintings still needed care. The staff still needed wages. The rich rooms looked richer than ever, frescoed ceilings and chandeliers that sparkled like frozen waterfalls, while the balance sheet turned quietly catastrophic. By the late 1870s, the estate's debts had climbed past £200,000. That is roughly $24 million in modern terms, secured against land and future income, a weight that pressed down on every decision. The Duke could not sell the palace. Who would buy it? What buyer existed for a house that required £12,000 a year just to survive? He could not abandon it. The social cost would be ruinous, a duke fleeing his own seat like a bankrupt merchant. He had one asset left that could be converted to cash quickly, without scandal, in a way that looked like refinement rather than desperation. The art collection. Accumulated over generations, it represented millions of pounds in portable, sellable wealth. Paintings could be moved. Sculptures could be crated. Porcelain could be cataloged and shipped to London, where the auction houses waited like carrion birds, polite and professional, and very, very good at turning culture into currency. The decision was made in private, discussed with trustees and lawyers, framed as a rational restructuring of assets. The family did not need every painting. Some pieces had been in storage for years. The collection had grown too large to properly display. Selling portions of it was responsible stewardship, not failure. That is what the Duke told himself. That is what he told his wife. The art was not sold because it was unwanted. It was sold because the palace had become too expensive to keep. When a collection became a lifeboat, the art was not sold because it was unwanted. It was sold because the palace had become too expensive to keep. On the 17th of June, 1882, the doors of Christie's auction house in London opened to a crowd that had been gathering since dawn. Dealers, collectors, museum curators, aristocrats with cash, and aristocrats without it, all pressed into the viewing rooms to see what the Hamiltons had brought to market. The sale had been advertised for weeks. 2013 separate lots. Paintings, sculpture, furniture, porcelain, manuscripts, arms and armor, tapestries, clocks, and objects so rare they had their own footnotes in art history. This was not an estate sale. This was the dismemberment of a dynasty. The first lot went under the hammer at midday, a small Italian Renaissance panel attributed to the school of Perugino. It sold for 38 guineas, roughly £4,000 in modern value. The room barely noticed. Everyone was waiting for the masterpieces, and they did not have to wait long. Lot 43, a portrait by Anthony van Dyck, sold for 2,500 guineas. The room stirred. Lot 91, a mythological scene by Peter Paul Rubens, went for 3,200 guineas. By the end of the first day, Christie's had moved through 400 lots and taken in over £50,000. The second day brought more. The third day broke records. Paintings that had hung in the same gallery for a century were parceled out to bidders from across Europe and America, each one slipping away like a piece of the family's history, converted into ledger entries. The sale ran for 17 days. Across those days, Christie's sold nearly everything the Hamiltons had sent. The final tally reached £397,000, equivalent to roughly £48 million today. It was one of the largest single art sales of the 19th century, a flood of wealth that poured into the Duke's accounts and briefly made the estate's debts look manageable. But the collection was gone. The walls of the picture gallery, which had once held layers of paintings stacked frame to frame, now showed pale rectangles where the canvases had hung. The sculpture niches stood empty. The cabinets that had displayed Ming porcelain and Sèvres vases were cleared, their shelves bare except for dust. Visitors who returned to Hamilton Palace after the sale described it as haunted, not by ghosts, but by absence. The rooms still functioned, the chandeliers still glittered, but the soul had been auctioned. Some pieces stayed in Britain. The National Gallery acquired a Van Dyck. Private collectors in London and Edinburgh bought others. But many crossed the Atlantic. American industrialists, newly rich and hungry for European prestige, snapped up paintings and sculpture with the kind of money that British aristocrats could no longer match. A Titian went to a financier in New York. A set of Renaissance bronzes ended up in Boston. The Hamilton collection scattered across the globe, fragments of a whole that would never be reassembled. The Duke used the proceeds exactly as planned. Estate debts were paid down, though not eliminated. Urgent repairs to the palace were funded. The household budget was stabilized, at least for a few years. On paper, the sale had worked. The crisis had been managed. The palace remained operational. But the loss was more than financial. The collection had been the palace's justification. It had transformed Hamilton Palace from an oversized house into a cultural monument, a place where art and history lived under one roof. Without it, the palace was just big, just expensive, just a pile of rooms that required constant care and gave back nothing but the fading glow of ancestral pride. The 1882 sale should have been a warning. It proved that the palace could not sustain itself on traditional income. Coal royalties fluctuated. Land rents were static. The global economy was integrating, and old money was losing ground to new fortunes built on industry and trade. If the Hamiltons wanted to keep their palace alive, they needed a new strategy. They needed income that did not depend on tenant farmers or stock dividends. They needed something reliable, extractable, and close to home. Yet they needed the coal under their feet, not just the royalties from distant seams. The coal directly beneath the palace grounds, millions of tons of it, sitting in geological seams that mining companies eyed with professional hunger. The estate's surveyors had mapped it. The engineers had assessed it. The coal was there, rich and accessible, worth a fortune if properly exploited. But mining under a palace is not like mining under a field. The ground does not care about chandeliers. Stone foundations built to last centuries do not negotiate with subsidence. If you chase coal beneath a structure that weighs thousands of tons, eventually the structure notices. Cracks form, floors tilt, walls shift, slowly at first, then faster. A palace built to defy time can be undone by the very wealth hidden beneath it. The Duke and his trustees knew the risk. They had engineers' reports. They understood, in theory, what could happen. But theory is abstract, and debt is immediate. The palace needed money now. The coal could provide it. The decision, when it came, was not dramatic. It was paperwork. Leases signed in solicitors' offices, mineral rights transferred, permissions granted. The coal companies moved in, sinking shafts and driving tunnels, extracting value from the dark seams below. Above ground, the palace stood as it always had, white stone gleaming, dome rising against the sky, rooms filled with furniture and staff and the routines of aristocratic life. But beneath it, invisible and patient, the ground was being hollowed out, and palaces, for all their grandeur, cannot float on air. What happens when you turn the foundation of your monument into a revenue stream? The Hamiltons were about to learn, not immediately, not in a single collapse, but slowly the way stone cracks, one fracture at a time. The coal lease signed in silence. The most important decision about Hamilton Palace was not made in a ballroom. It was made in paperwork. Mineral rights in Scotland operate under a logic older than most nations. The surface belongs to one party. The depths belong to another. A landowner might walk across fields he has owned for centuries, but the coal, iron, or limestone beneath his boots could be leased, sold, or exploited by someone else entirely. This division made fortunes for some families and destroyed others. For the Hamiltons, it became both. The estate had been leasing mineral rights for decades. By the 1880s, coal companies operated across Hamilton lands, sinking pits and driving levels through seams that lay safely distant from the palace itself. The Duke collected royalties based on tonnage extracted, a percentage that arrived quarterly and helped plug gaps in the accounts. It was clean money, in a sense. The Duke did not have to manage the mines. He did not have to deal with labor disputes or equipment failures. The coal companies handled the risk. The Duke collected the reward, but the richest seams did not lie distant. They ran directly under the palace grounds, thick bands of coal mapped by geologists who understood exactly what they were looking at. The L seam, the splint seam, the main seam. Together, they represented millions of tons of high-quality coal, perfect for industry, lying at depths that made extraction straightforward. Mining companies wanted access. They sent letters. They made offers. The royalties would be substantial, enough to cover the palace's annual operating costs with margin to spare. The engineers' reports were careful. Mining beneath a large structure required precision. Pillars of coal would need to be left in place to support the ground above. The working faces would have to advance slowly, monitoring for movement. Subsidence was possible, the reports admitted, but it could be managed if the work was done properly. The word "if" carried weight, but it was easy to read past. The trustees met in the library, not the family's lawyers, not outside advisors, but the small circle of men who managed the estate's financial reality. They reviewed the numbers. The palace's debts had stabilized after the 1882 sale, but stabilized is not the same as solved. Income still trailed expenditure. Without new revenue, the estate would slide back into crisis within a decade. The coal beneath the palace could prevent that. It could, in theory, turn Hamilton Palace from a liability into a sustainable enterprise. One trustee raised the obvious concern. What if the mining caused damage? What if the structure began to settle? The response was pragmatic. The companies had experience. The reports were confident. And more to the point, refusing the coal meant refusing the income, which meant closing parts of the palace, dismissing staff, retreating into a smaller version of aristocratic life. That was unacceptable. The Hamiltons did not retreat. They adapted. The lease was signed in 1890. Not shouted from the rooftops, not announced in the press, but filed quietly with the estate's legal documents. The terms were standard. The coal companies paid royalties per ton extracted. They assumed responsibility for safe working practices. The Duke retained ownership of the surface. The mining would proceed under the estate's western grounds first, testing the methods, then gradually extend toward the palace itself if all went well. For the first few years, it did go well. The western pits produced steadily. The royalties arrived on schedule. There were no reports of surface damage, no complaints from tenants, no cracks appearing in garden walls. The trustees congratulated themselves. The decision had been sound. Modern engineering had made it possible to extract wealth from beneath a historic structure without harm. Progress and tradition could coexist. Then the companies requested permission to extend workings closer to the palace. The western seams were thinning. The richest coal lay directly under the main structure, beneath the state apartments and the Great Hall. Coal that could be extracted using the same careful methods that had worked elsewhere. The royalties would increase significantly. The estate's financial position would improve overnight. The request went to the trustees again. This time, the engineers' reports were more cautious. Working beneath the palace itself introduced variables. The building's weight concentrated pressure on the underlying rock. The foundations were deep, but they rested on geology that would shift if the supporting coal was removed. Subsidence could not be ruled out, but the reports continued. Subsidence could be minimized with proper pillar placement and controlled extraction. It was a risk, not a certainty. The trustees approved, not because they dismissed the risk, but because they had no better option. The estate needed money. The coal was there. The companies were willing. Saying no meant accepting decline. Saying yes meant rolling the dice on engineering competence and geological luck. By the mid-1890s, the coal companies had sunk new shafts on the palace's eastern boundary. The tunnels advanced slowly, carving through the L seam, then the splint, leaving pillars of coal to hold the roof. Above ground, life continued. The Duke hosted shooting parties. The staff maintained the gardens. Guests arrived by train and carriage, stepping into the entrance hall with no idea that beneath their feet, men were digging in the dark, loosening the ground inch by inch. The palace had become a performance. The rooms gleamed, the dinners sparkled, but underneath, invisible and relentless, the foundation was being monetized. The estate was eating itself to stay alive, turning permanence into quarterly income, trading tomorrow's stability for today's cash flow. It was rational, it was desperate, and it was, in the cold logic of aristocratic survival, the only choice that made sense. By 1915, the mining beneath the palace is no longer a rumor. It is an active threat to the walls. But that revelation lay years ahead, buried in the same depths as the coal. For now, the palace stood, and the money flowed, and the Hamiltons told themselves that they had found a way to preserve their monument without sacrificing their position. They were wrong, but the cracks had not yet appeared. And in the absence of visible damage, it was easy to believe that the ground would hold forever. The first cracks nobody wanted named. A house this proud does not collapse in one day. It begins with doors that no longer close cleanly. The head housekeeper noticed it first, in 1903. The door to the blue drawing room, a heavy thing of carved oak with brass fittings, had always shut with a satisfying click. Now it dragged against the frame, scraping wood on wood, requiring a shoulder's pressure to force it closed. She mentioned it to the estate carpenter, who planed the edge and sent her away satisfied. 3 months later, the door stuck again. The carpenter returned, frowning. He checked the hinges. He measured the frame. Everything was square, or should have been. He planed another sliver of wood and left, less satisfied this time. By 1904, the door would not close at all without visible warping of the frame. The carpenter stopped trying to fix it. He reported it upward to the estate's senior steward, who noted it in a ledger and said nothing to the family. Because the blue drawing room was not the only problem. Across the palace, small fractures had begun appearing in the plasterwork. Hairline cracks, mostly, running from ceiling corners or tracing the edges of window frames. Easy to blame on seasonal expansion and contraction, the natural movement of a large building through winter cold and summer heat. The staff filled them with plaster, painted over them, and moved on. But the cracks came back, same locations, longer each time. In 1907, a housemaid reported that the floor in the East Wing corridor had developed a tilt. Not dramatic, just a gentle slope where there should have been level ground. You could feel it if you walked slowly, a subtle pull to one side, like the floor was trying to drain somewhere. The estate surveyor was called. He brought instruments, took measurements, and filed a report that used careful language. The floor had settled approximately 3 inches at the eastern end relative to the western. The settlement was consistent with minor subsidence. Monitoring was recommended. Subsidence. The word arrived in the estate's correspondence like a diagnosis nobody wanted confirmed. It meant the ground was moving. It meant the structure was responding. It meant, if you followed the logic far enough, that the coal mining beneath the palace might be causing damage. But proving causation was complicated. Subsidence could result from many factors: old foundations settling, clay soils compressing, natural geological shifts. The coal companies, when quietly approached, pointed to their pillars, their controlled extraction methods, their experience. They had mined beneath structures before. Subsidence was always possible, but severe damage was rare if the work was managed properly. The Duke received the surveyor's report and filed it. What else could he do? Stopping the mining meant stopping the royalties, which the estate could not afford. Suing the coal companies meant expensive litigation with uncertain outcomes. And publicly admitting that Hamilton Palace was suffering subsidence would destroy its value, both financial and symbolic. Better to monitor, to repair, to hope that the settling would stabilize. It did not stabilize. By 1910, the cracks had spread to the state apartments. Not hairline fractures anymore, but visible fissures that split plaster and exposed the brick beneath. The great staircase developed a lean, subtle, but measurable, enough that a marble rolled from the top step would curve slightly to the left on its way down. The staff learned to walk carefully in certain corridors where the floorboards had warped and nails protruded. At night, the palace made sounds, creaks and groans that echoed through empty halls, noises that servants attributed to wind or settling wood. But some of the sounds were deeper, more structural. Yes, the kind of low rumble that comes from stone shifting against stone. A footman swore he heard a crack like a rifle shot one winter evening, loud enough to make him drop the tray he was carrying. When he investigated, he found a fresh fracture running floor to ceiling in the south gallery, a split so wide you could slide a penny into it. The estate tried to keep the damage quiet. Repairs were made at night or during periods when the family was absent. Visitors were steered away from the worst corridors. Rooms that had become unsafe were locked and declared closed for refurbishment. The public face of Hamilton Palace remained intact. The private reality was a building under siege from its own foundation. By 1912, the engineers could no longer offer reassurances. A firm from Glasgow was brought in to assess the structure's integrity. Their report, delivered in the spring of 1913, was blunt. The palace was experiencing active subsidence caused by coal extraction beneath the foundations. The damage would continue as long as mining continued. Some areas were already unsafe. The long-term prognosis, if the coal companies did not cease operations, was catastrophic structural failure. Not immediately, but inevitably. The Duke convened his trustees. The report sat on the table between them, 30 pages of technical language that boiled down to a simple truth. The palace was sinking. The mining had gone too far. The pillars of coal left in place were not sufficient to hold the ground stable. Every ton of coal extracted weakened the foundation further. The question was not whether the palace would suffer major damage. The question was when. The trustees faced an impossible choice. Demand that the coal companies stop mining, which would require breaking the lease agreements and likely trigger legal battles that could bankrupt the estate. Or allow the mining to continue, accept the subsidence, and manage the damage as long as possible while collecting the royalties that kept the household running. They chose the royalties, not out of greed, but out of desperation. The estate had no alternative income source large enough to replace the coal money. Without it, the palace would have to close anyway, not from subsidence, but from insolvency. At least with the mining continuing, there was cash flow. At least there was time. But time was the one thing the palace no longer had. The cracks kept spreading. The floors kept tilting. Rooms that had hosted kings and queens were quietly abandoned, their doors locked, their furniture covered in dust sheets. The staff walked through halls that felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for something to give. Who chooses income now over survival later? The Hamiltons did, and in making that choice, they guaranteed that Hamilton Palace would not outlive the coal beneath it. The point of no return, 1915. By 1915, the mining beneath the palace is no longer a rumor. It is an active threat to the walls. The Great War changed everything, including the economics of coal. Demand surged. Factories needed fuel. Ships needed coal for their boilers. The government requisitioned output, paying premium prices, and the companies operating beneath Hamilton Palace increased their extraction rates to meet quotas. The royalties flowing to the estate jumped accordingly. For a brief moment, it looked like the war might save the palace's finances, but the increased mining accelerated the subsidence. By the summer of 1915, the damage was impossible to hide. The South Gallery, which had once displayed the finest paintings in the collection, now had a floor that visibly sagged in the center. Engineers placed spirit levels across the boards and watched the bubbles slide. The drop measured 8 inches from east to west, enough to make walking the length of the room feel like descending a gentle hill. The dome above the entrance hall began to show stress cracks in its masonry. The dome was the palace's signature, visible for miles, a symbol of ducal grandeur that announced the family's status to anyone approaching. Now it was cracking from the inside, hairline fractures radiating from the base where the structure's weight concentrated. Engineers examined it and delivered a grim verdict. The dome was still stable, but if the subsidence continued, it could fail. And if it failed, it would collapse inward, bringing tons of stone and plasterwork down onto the entrance hall below. The 12th Duke, William Alexander Louis Stephen Douglas Hamilton, was 64 years old and had spent most of his adult life managing an inheritance he could not afford and could not abandon. The war had taken his attention. His sons were serving. The estate's focus had shifted to supporting the war effort, hosting convalescent soldiers, contributing to relief funds. But the palace's structural crisis would not wait for peace. In November 1915, the Duke requested an emergency meeting with the coal companies. The session took place in Glasgow, in a solicitor's office, with engineers present on both sides. The Duke's representative presented the evidence: photographs of cracks, surveyors' reports showing cumulative subsidence of over 2 feet in some areas, engineering assessments declaring portions of the palace unsafe for habitation. The conclusion was unavoidable. The mining had to stop, or the building would be lost. The coal companies listened. Then they presented their own case. The lease agreements were legal and binding. The estate had accepted royalties for decades, knowing the risks. The mining had been conducted according to standard practice, with pillars left in place as specified. If the palace was suffering damage, that was unfortunate, but the companies had fulfilled their contractual obligations. Stopping the mining would require compensation for lost profits, calculated based on the remaining coal reserves. The figure mentioned was substantial, far more than the estate could pay. The meeting ended in stalemate. The Duke could not afford to buy out the leases. The coal companies would not stop mining voluntarily. Legally, both sides had arguments. Morally, the situation was grotesque. A historic building was being destroyed for profit, and the law offered no clear remedy. The Duke returned to Hamilton Palace and walked through the damaged rooms. He saw the cracks, He felt the uneven floors. He stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the dome, imagining it falling. And he understood, with the clarity that comes from despair, that the palace was already lost. Not today, not this year, but inevitably. The ground had been sold out from under it, and no amount of legal maneuvering or engineering could reverse that. In early 1916, the estate began restricting access to the most damaged areas. The South Gallery was closed permanently. The East Wing was declared unsafe except for essential maintenance. Guests were no longer invited to stay overnight. The palace, which had been built to accommodate royalty, now housed only the immediate family and a skeleton staff. It had become a monument in retreat, closing room by room, withdrawing into itself like an animal conserving warmth. The coal companies kept mining. The royalties kept arriving. The subsidence kept worsening. By 1917, and the palace required constant monitoring. Engineers visited monthly, measuring cracks, assessing stability, filing reports that documented a slow-motion collapse. The structure was not going to fall suddenly. It was going to settle and crack and warp until it became uninhabitable, a shell too dangerous to enter and too expensive to repair. The Duke consulted with his trustees and his lawyers. Could the palace be stabilized? Theoretically, yes. If the mining stopped and extensive underpinning was performed, driving new foundations deep into stable rock, the structure might be saved. The cost would be astronomical, far beyond the estate's resources. Could the building be partially demolished, saving the most important rooms? Perhaps, but what remained would be a fragment, a ruin that advertised failure rather than grandeur. The trustees began discussing a third option: controlled disposal, empty the palace of its remaining contents, sell what could be sold, then seek legal authority to demolish the structure entirely, clearing the site before it became a public hazard. The suggestion was met with silence. Demolition meant admitting total defeat. It meant erasing the family's greatest monument, the building that had defined their identity for a century. But the alternative was worse. If they waited, if they let the subsidence progress unchecked, the palace might collapse on its own terms, possibly killing someone, certainly destroying whatever salvage value remained in the fittings and materials. Demolition, if it came to that, needed to be deliberate, managed, legal. In 1918, the Duke applied to the Court of Session in Edinburgh for authority to sell the palace's remaining contents and fixtures. The application was phrased carefully. It did not mention demolition directly. It spoke of financial necessity, of the impossibility of maintaining the structure, of the trustees' fiduciary duty to protect the estate's assets. But everyone understood what it meant. The Duke was preparing to dismantle Hamilton Palace. The court scheduled a hearing. The legal process would take months, possibly years. In the meantime, the palace stood, sinking inch by inch, while the family waited for permission to let it go. The building is now living on borrowed time. The question is not whether it will end. The question is how much of it can be saved before the ground finishes what the coal companies started. The court that approved a death. The palace did not die in a storm. It died when a court granted permission to empty it. The hearing took place in Edinburgh on the 4th of March, 1919. The Court of Session, Scotland's supreme civil court, occupied a neoclassical building on Parliament Square, a place where property disputes and trust law were settled with the weight of centuries behind every ruling. The Duke's legal team presented their petition. The estate was insolvent without drastic action. The palace had become unsafe due to mining subsidence. Maintaining it was financially impossible. Selling the contents and fittings was the only way to preserve any value for future generations. The opposing voice came from unexpected quarters, not the coal companies, who had no legal standing to block a disposal sale, not rival aristocrats, who generally avoided interfering in another family's private ruin, but from historical preservation advocates, a small group of architects and scholars who argued that Hamilton Palace was a national treasure, that its destruction would be a cultural catastrophe, that the court had a moral duty to prevent its dismantling. Their argument was passionate. The palace represented the peak of Scottish aristocratic architecture. Its interiors were irreplaceable. Its art historical significance transcended the Duke's personal finances. Allowing it to be stripped and demolished would deprive Scotland of a monument that belonged, in some sense, to everyone. The court should deny the petition and force the estate to find alternative solutions. The Duke's lawyers responded with numbers. The estate owed creditors. The palace required repairs estimated at over £100,000, roughly 12 million in modern terms, just to stabilize the structure. Even if that money could be borrowed, which it could not, the annual maintenance costs would still exceed income. There were no buyers for a palace in this condition. There were no alternative solutions. The choice was controlled disposal or chaotic collapse. The judges deliberated for 3 weeks. On the 25th of March, 1919, they issued their ruling. The trustees were granted authority to sell the contents and fixtures of Hamilton Palace. The decision was framed as a matter of property rights. The Duke owned the palace. The estate's creditors had claims. The court could not force an insolvent estate to maintain a building it could not afford, no matter how historically significant. The ruling was a death sentence delivered in legal language. With permission secured, the trustees moved quickly. Auctioneers were contacted. Inventories were prepared. Every room was cataloged. Every piece of furniture tagged. Every fitting assessed for salvage value. The process took months, armies of clerks and appraisers moving through the palace with notebooks and cameras, recording what would soon be scattered. The first major sale was held in situ, on site at the palace, beginning in June 1919. Dealers and collectors arrived by train, walking through rooms that still smelled of damp plaster and coal smoke, bidding on furniture that had furnished ducal life for generations. A set of Regency dining chairs sold for £80. A carved mahogany bookcase went for £60. A chandelier from the state drawing room, 3 tiers of crystal that had glittered over countless dinners, fetched £250. The prices were decent, but not spectacular. The market knew these were distress sales. The June sale raised approximately £14,000. Useful, but not enough. The estate needed more. In October 1919, a second sale took place, this time focusing on architectural fittings. Marble fireplaces were prized from walls. Paneling was carefully removed and numbered. Wrought iron gates from the gardens were unbolted and loaded onto wagons. Even the floorboards from the state apartments, finest oak laid in intricate patterns, were lifted and sold. By the end of 1919, Hamilton Palace had been systematically gutted. What remained was structure and decay, and empty rooms with exposed brick, fireplaces reduced to rectangular voids, windows without curtains. The shell still stood, but it had been reduced to the architectural equivalent of a skeleton. The soul, if a building has one, had been auctioned off in lots, dispersed to dealers and collectors who would resell it for profit. The total proceeds from the 1919 sales reached approximately £22,000, roughly 2.6 million in modern value. It helped settle some debts. It funded essential estate operations. But it did not save the palace because the palace could not be saved. The subsidence had progressed too far. The structure was a liability now, not an asset. And with the contents gone, there was no reason to delay the final step. In March 1920, the trustees petitioned the court again, so this time requesting explicit authority to demolish the palace and sell the site. The petition cited public safety. The building was unstable. Portions of it could collapse without warning. Leaving it standing risked injury or death. The responsible action was controlled demolition, clearing the site while salvaging any materials that retained value. The court granted the request in April. No opposition this time. The preservation advocates had lost. The public had watched the contents dispersed and understood that the building was beyond rescue. The legal pathway was clear. Hamilton Palace could be torn down, but demolition required a buyer. Not a buyer for the palace as a building, but a buyer for the right to dismantle it and take the materials. Stone, timber, lead, iron, all had salvage value. The challenge was finding a contractor willing to undertake the work, to invest in equipment and labor on the gamble that the materials could be resold for profit. In October 1921, a demolition firm from Glasgow submitted a bid. They offered £5,000 for the palace and the right to dismantle it completely. £5,000 for a building that had cost the equivalent of tens of millions to construct and furnish. The trustees accepted. They had no other offers, no other options. The contract was signed on the 26th of October, 1921. The demolition would commence in November. The palace, which had stood for over a century as the greatest private residence in Scotland, would be erased within 2 years. What is a palace once its soul is auctioned? It is a shell waiting for the first blow of the hammer. It is a monument that chose income over integrity and paid the only price that remains when all the money is gone. It is a lesson in what happens when you mine the foundation of your own legacy and call it financial planning. The court approved the death. The market would execute it. And Hamilton Palace, empty and cracking, stood through the autumn of 1921 like a prisoner waiting for the sentence to be carried out, stripping a giant to the bones. When the contents left, the palace stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a shell waiting for weather. The final weeks before demolition had an eerie quality. Staff who had worked at the palace for decades walked through empty rooms, their footsteps echoing on bare floors. The chandeliers were gone. The paintings were gone. The furniture, the carpets, the curtains that had softened the light, all of it removed or sold. What remained were walls and windows and the ghost of what had been. A housekeeper who had served the family for 30 years described it later in a letter. She wrote that walking the state apartments felt like moving through a corpse. The rooms still had their shape, their proportions, but they had lost their warmth. No fires in the grates, no candles on the mantels, just cold air and the smell of damp stone. She said the palace had started to feel like it was grieving. The salvage teams arrived in November 1921, just as the contract specified. They were not delicate. They were efficient. Demolition is a business of tonnage and time, and Hamilton Palace represented both. The building's materials had value if they could be extracted quickly and sold before the market shifted. Speed mattered more than sentiment. The first targets were the decorative elements that had not been sold in the earlier auctions. Carved stone capitals from the columns in the entrance hall, prized loose with crowbars and lowered on ropes. Ornamental plasterwork from the ceilings, medallions and moldings that took craftsmen months to install and took salvagers hours to destroy. Some pieces broke in the removal, others were damaged beyond resale. The workers did not care. They were paid by weight, not by beauty. The lead roofing came next. Lead was valuable, easily melted down and resold. Teams climbed onto the palace's roof and began stripping the sheets, rolling them up, stacking them on wagons. Without the lead, rain began entering the upper floors. Water pooled in the attics, seeped through ceilings, stained the walls with long, dark streaks. The palace, which had been meticulously maintained for over a century, was now exposed to weather like a ruin. By December, the roof timbers were being removed. Massive oak beams, some of them 2 feet square, were cut free and hauled out through openings in the walls. The beams had supported the roof since the building's construction, solid and strong, but they had salvage value as reclaimed timber. Buyers existed for old oak, craftsmen who would mill it into flooring or furniture and charge a premium for the provenance. The palace's bones were being sold piece by piece. With the roof open, the interior began to decay rapidly. Rain soaked the plaster, which softened and fell in chunks. The wallpaper, though hand-printed silk in some rooms, peeled and rotted. The wooden floors warped. Frost entered during cold snaps, cracking whatever the rain had missed. By the spring of 1922, the palace looked like it had been abandoned for decades, not months. Nature was reclaiming it faster than the demolition crews could tear it down. The stonework was the most labor-intensive part. The palace's exterior walls were built from sandstone blocks, each one cut and dressed by hand, fitted so precisely that mortar barely showed in the joints. The blocks had value, but extracting them required dismantling the walls carefully, lowering each stone without shattering it. It was slow work. The crews used hand tools, sledgehammers, and chisels, breaking mortar joints and levering blocks free. Each block weighed hundreds of pounds. Each block took time. The great staircase resisted longest. It was built from marble, massive slabs imported from Italy, installed with iron pins and lead joints. The staircase had been the palace's showpiece, a sweeping curve of white stone that rose 3 stories, lit by a dome overhead. Demolishing it meant cutting the marble into sections, a process that dulled saw blades and exhausted workers. Some slabs cracked under the strain and had to be discarded. Others were salvaged intact and sold to builders in Glasgow, where they ended up in office buildings and banks, anonymous fragments of a lost whole. By the summer of 1922, the palace was more rubble than building. The wings had been reduced to waist-high walls. The central block still stood, but only because the demolition crews were working methodically, floor by floor, room by room. In the dome over the entrance hall, which had developed cracks from subsidence, was taken down carefully. It could have been left to collapse, but the risk of uncontrolled failure was too high. Workers dismantled it, stone by stone, lowering the pieces on ropes, a process that took weeks. The entrance hall, which had welcomed guests for over 80 years, was the last major interior to fall. The marble columns were cut at their bases and toppled, shattering when they hit the ground. The floor, inlaid with rare woods in geometric patterns, was ripped up and sorted. Some pieces were salvageable, Others were too damaged, fit only for firewood. The workers burned what they could not sell, using the palace's own materials to fuel bonfires that kept them warm on cold mornings. By 1923, the main structure was gone. What remained was the foundation, a maze of cellars and vaults that had supported the palace's weight. The cellars were massive, brick-arched spaces that had housed the kitchens, the wine storage, the coal stores, the servants' quarters. The demolition crews explored them with lanterns, finding forgotten relics, old bottles, broken furniture, ledgers from the 1800s. None of it had value. It was left to rot. The cellars were filled with rubble from the demolition, tons of broken stone and plaster and timber shoved into the underground spaces to level the site. The foundation vaults became a tomb for the palace, buried under its own ruins. By 1924, the site was flat. If you stood where the entrance hall had been, you saw grass and weeds and scattered piles of unsold stone. The palace had vanished. The demolition contract had estimated 2 years. It took closer to 3. The palace's construction had been so solid, so over-engineered, that taking it apart proved harder than the contractors expected. The irony was sharp. The Hamiltons had built a palace to last forever, and it resisted destruction with the same stubbornness it had resisted time. But resistance is not survival. By 1925, Hamilton Palace existed only in photographs, in the memories of those who had seen it, and in the scattered fragments sold to dealers across Britain. The largest private residence in Scotland had been erased, converted into salvage and profit, leaving behind a flat piece of ground that told no story to anyone who had not known what stood there before. What is a palace once its soul is auctioned? It is nothing, just air and absence. Just a plot of land waiting for the next use. The palace had died when the court granted permission to empty it, but it finished dying slowly, resisting until the last stone was prized free and hauled away. Sold for scrap, then taken apart. In October 1921, the palace is sold for dismantling, and the work begins the next month. The contractor who bought Hamilton Palace for £5,000 was named James Black, a Glasgow demolition specialist who had made a career from tearing down industrial buildings and reselling the materials. He understood tonnage. He understood markets. He understood that a palace, stripped of sentiment, was just an inventory of stone, timber, lead, iron, and glass. If he could extract and sell those materials efficiently, the £5,000 investment would return multiples. Black arrived at the site in early November 1921 with a crew of 40 men and a plan. The plan was simple. Start at the top and work down. Remove the valuable materials first, the lead roofing, the decorative stonework, the salvageable timber. Then dismantle the structure itself, selling the building stone to quarries and builders. Finally, clear the cellars and level the site, leaving flat ground that could be sold or repurposed. The timeline was ambitious. Black estimated the work would take 18 months. He hired local laborers to supplement his core crew, men from Hamilton and the surrounding towns who needed work and did not mind the grim task of tearing apart a monument. They were paid by the day, a few shillings for hard labor, swinging sledgehammers and hauling stone from dawn until dark. The first month was profitable. The lead roofing alone brought in several £100, decorative elements from the staterooms, carved stone and ornamental plaster, sold quickly to dealers who specialized in architectural salvage. The palace's chandeliers, which had escaped the earlier auctions, were removed and resold. Even the door fittings, brass handles, and iron hinges had value. But by January 1922, the work had slowed. The easy materials were gone. What remained was structure. Thick walls built to carry the weight of floors and roofs, constructed with a solidity that made demolition difficult. The sandstone blocks were heavy and awkward, requiring teams of men to shift each one. The mortar was hard, harder than modern cement, resistant to chisels and hammers. Progress measured in feet, not rooms. The weather did not help. Winter in Lanarkshire is cold and wet, with rain that turns work sites into mud pits. The demolition crews worked in conditions that modern health and safety standards would never allow. No protective equipment, no scaffolding that met structural codes. Men perched on crumbling walls, prying stones loose, trusting luck and balance to keep them from falling. Several workers were injured. One man died when a section of wall collapsed unexpectedly, crushing him under tons of stone. The work paused for a day, then resumed. By spring 1922, Black realized he had underestimated the job. The palace was not going to be demolished in 18 months. The structure was too large, too solid, too resistant. He renegotiated with his buyers, extending timelines, adjusting prices. Some materials did not sell as well as expected. Building stone that looked impressive in a palace looked ordinary in a pile. Buyers wanted discounts. Profit margins shrank. The palace fought back in small ways. Floors that appeared stable collapsed when workers walked on them, weakened by subsidence and rot. Hidden voids in the walls trapped men until they could be pulled free. The cellars flooded during heavy rains, turning the underground spaces into pools that had to be pumped dry before work could continue. The building seemed to resist its own destruction, as if stone could hold grudges. By summer 1922, the site resembled a quarry. Piles of stone everywhere, sorted by size and quality. Mountains of rubble from broken plaster and unusable brick. Timber stacked in rough cords, waiting for buyers who never arrived in the numbers Black expected. The palace was half gone, but the other half remained, stubborn and slow to yield. Black brought in more laborers. He worked the crews harder, extending shifts, pushing for faster progress. The pace increased, but so did the costs. Wages, equipment maintenance, transport for the salvaged materials, it all added up. By the end of 1922, Black was no longer confident he would make a profit. Breaking even would be a success. The demolition dragged into 1923. The central block, which had housed the state apartments and the Great Hall, came down floor by floor. The workers established a rhythm: break the mortar, lever the stones, lower them on ropes, stack them, move to the next section. It was brutal, repetitive work, the kind that destroys backs and hands, leaving men old before their time. The marble staircase took 2 months to dismantle. The stone was valuable, but it was also massive and fragile. Cutting it without shattering required skill and patience. Black hired stonemasons, craftsmen who understood how to work marble, and paid them premium wages. The salvage slabs sold well, recouping some of the investment, but the time required ate into the schedule. By 1924, the palace was mostly rubble. The wings were gone. The central block was reduced to foundation walls and cellars. Black's crews filled the cellars with debris, leveling the site as they progressed. The plan was to leave flat ground, ready for redevelopment or sale. But even filling the cellars took time. The vaults were deep and extensive, requiring wagon loads of rubble to fill. The final stone was removed in early 1925. The site was cleared, the rubble sorted and sold or buried, the ground leveled. Black surveyed what remained. A flat piece of land, roughly 12 acres, scarred by demolition, but empty. Hamilton Palace was gone, erased. The largest private residence in Britain had been converted into salvage and profit over 3.5 years of relentless labor. Black's final accounting showed a narrow profit. The £5,000 purchase price, plus labor and equipment costs, totaled roughly £12,000. The salvaged materials sold for approximately £15,000. A profit of £3,000, roughly $360,000 in modern value for 3 years of work and the destruction of a cultural monument. The palace ceased to be a building and became a site. Flat ground where something monumental had stood. The subsidence that had doomed the structure was no longer visible. The cracks, the tilting floors, the settling walls, all of it had been removed and scattered. What the coal mining started, the demolition finished. Hamilton Palace died twice. First when the ground betrayed it. Second when the hammers came. And in the end, the palace was worth exactly what the market said it was worth. £5,000, not a penny more, the town that inherited a void. After the last great rooms were gone, Hamilton was left with land, memories, and a question of what progress really means. The town of Hamilton had grown up in the shadow of the palace. For over a century, the palace had been the town's defining landmark, the reason visitors came, the source of employment for gardeners and servants and tradesmen. When the palace stood, Hamilton had an identity. It was the place where Scotland's grandest ducal residence dominated the skyline, where aristocratic power met industrial Scotland. When the palace fell, the town did not collapse, but it changed. The 12 acres where the palace had stood became empty ground, a void in the town's geography and psychology. Local residents who had grown up seeing the dome on the horizon now saw nothing. The absence was disorienting, like losing a tooth and constantly probing the gap with your tongue. In the immediate aftermath of demolition, the site was left undeveloped. The Duke's estate still owned the land, but there was no money for development and no clear vision for what to do with it. The ground was flat but scarred, marked by shallow depressions where the cellars had been filled, weeds growing through the rubble that the demolition crews had not fully cleared. It looked like what it was, a grave. Local children played on the site, climbing over the remaining foundation stones, exploring the few accessible cellar spaces that had not been filled. They found fragments of the palace, pieces of carved stone, shards of pottery, broken glass. The fragments became treasures, souvenirs of a building most of them had never seen intact. The older residents discouraged the play, calling it disrespectful, but they did not stop it. What else was the land for? By the 1930s, the estate began considering options. The land could be sold for housing development. It could be donated to the town for public use. It could be left empty, a memorial to the palace's loss. Each option had advocates. Property developers saw potential. Town planners saw an opportunity for a park. Preservationists argued that developing the site would complete the cultural crime that demolition had started. The debate revealed a tension. Was the palace's destruction a tragedy or a liberation? For those who had worked there, for those who remembered its grandeur, the loss felt irreplaceable. For others, particularly those who had lived in poverty while the Hamiltons spent fortunes on art and architecture. The demolition felt like justice. The palace had been a monument to inequality, a display of wealth built on the labor and rents of ordinary people. Its destruction cleared space, literally and symbolically, for a more democratic use of the land. The town settled on a compromise. In 1937, the estate transferred a portion of the palace site to the local council for public use. The land became a park, open space with paths and benches, a place where anyone could walk. It was not a grand gesture. It was pragmatic. The estate could not afford to maintain empty land, and donating it generated goodwill and avoided property taxes. The park was named Low Parks, a reference to the original estate grounds. It opened quietly, without ceremony, just a new public space where a palace had stood. Residents used it. Families picnicked. Children played football. The park did not memorialize the palace. It did not explain what had been lost. It simply offered grass and trees and the freedom to occupy land that had once been private. What remained of the palace itself was scattered. Some of the salvaged stone was used in local construction projects, churches, and schools that incorporated Hamilton Palace's materials into their walls. The marble staircase slabs ended up in office buildings in Glasgow. Fireplaces appeared in manor houses across Scotland. Decorative elements were sold to collectors and dealers, disappearing into private hands. The town's relationship with the palace's memory was complicated. There was pride that Hamilton had once held such a monument. There was shame that Scotland had allowed it to be destroyed. There was relief that the land was now accessible. There was regret that nothing tangible remained to mark what had stood there. All of these emotions coexisted, unresolved. By the 1950s, the palace had faded from daily conversation. Older residents still remembered it. Younger generations knew it only from photographs and stories. The park became just a park, divorced from its origin. The palace site had been absorbed into the town's fabric, normalized, no longer a wound, but a scar. In the decades that followed, portions of the park were developed. A sports center was built in the 1970s. Later, a supermarket occupied part of the site. The land that had supported Scotland's grandest residents now supported mundane commerce and recreation. The transformation was complete. The palace's footprint had been erased, replaced by functions that served thousands of ordinary people instead of one aristocratic family. Was demolition a relief or an irreplaceable loss? The answer depends on who you ask and what you value. For architectural historians, the loss is absolute. Hamilton Palace was unique, a monument that could never be rebuilt. Its destruction, a cultural catastrophe that impoverished Scotland's heritage. For social historians, the palace's fall was inevitable, a consequence of an economic system that could not sustain such extravagance, a shift from aristocratic dominance to democratic land use. The town inherited a void, but voids can be filled. The land became something new, something accessible, something that served the many instead of the few. Whether that trade was worth it is a question Hamilton still lives with, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The museum pieces that escaped. Some parts of Hamilton Palace survived by fleeing Scotland, becoming trophies in other cities and other stories. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston holds a set of panels from Hamilton Palace. They are not displayed prominently. You have to know where to look in the European Decorative Arts Wing, tucked into a gallery that most visitors pass through quickly on their way to the paintings. The panels are carved oak, 18th century work, removed from one of the palace's state rooms during the final auctions. They were sold to a dealer in London, then resold to an American collector, then donated to the museum in the 1930s. The label identifies them as from Hamilton Palace, Scotland, and nothing more. Standing in front of those panels, you can reconstruct a fragment of what was lost. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The wood is carved in deep relief, showing classical scenes, gods, and mortals frozen in dramatic poses. The detail is microscopic. Individual fingers, fabric folds, expressions on faces no larger than a thumbnail. This is what wealth bought in the 18th century. Time, skill, patience. A craftsman could spend weeks carving a single panel, knowing it would be one of dozens in a room that guests might glance at for 30 seconds. The panels exist in Boston because they were small enough to move and valuable enough to sell. They survived because they escaped, but they are orphans now, separated from the context that gave them meaning. In Hamilton Palace, they were part of a whole, one element in a room designed to overwhelm. In a museum, they are curiosities, beautiful but isolated, their story reduced to a label that most people do not read. Other fragments scattered further. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London acquired several pieces of Hamilton Palace furniture, chairs and tables and cabinets that had furnished the state apartments. They sit in storage mostly, brought out occasionally for exhibitions on aristocratic interiors. The museum's records list them with precision. Carved giltwood side table, circa 1760, from Hamilton Palace. But the records cannot convey what it felt like to see that table in situ, in a room lit by chandeliers, surrounded by paintings and sculpture, and the weight of ducal presence. One of the palace's marble fireplaces ended up in a manor house in Perthshire, installed in a drawing room where it looks almost at home. Almost. But the proportions are wrong. The fireplace was designed for a room twice the size, with ceilings twice the height. In its new location, it dominates, overpowering the space instead of complementing it. The fireplace survived, but it lost its purpose. It is a refugee, sheltered but displaced. In the strangest survival is a door, just a door, carved mahogany with brass fittings, removed from the blue drawing room during the demolition. It was purchased by a dealer who sold it to a hotel in Edinburgh, where it was installed as the entrance to a private dining room. The door still functions. Guests push it open without knowing where it came from. It has outlived the palace by nearly a century, serving a purpose the Hamiltons never imagined. Photographs are the other survival. Before the palace was demolished, photographers documented the interiors, room by room, capturing what would soon be lost. The photographs are meticulous. You can see the chandeliers, the paintings on the walls, the furniture arranged with aristocratic precision. The images are black and white, but they convey scale and detail, and enough to let viewers reconstruct the palace in their minds. The photographs exist in archives, in the National Library of Scotland, in private collections, in books about lost architecture. They are studied by historians and architecture students, analyzed for what they reveal about design and taste, and the economics of grandeur. But photographs are not buildings. You cannot walk through a photograph. You cannot feel the temperature shift when you enter a marble hall. You cannot hear your footsteps echo. Photographs are ghosts, two-dimensional traces of three-dimensional reality. Some historians have attempted digital reconstructions, using the photographs and architectural plans to model Hamilton Palace in computer software. The models are impressive, showing the rooms in detail, allowing virtual tours through spaces that no longer exist. But even the best reconstruction is a simulation, a guess about light and texture, and the 1,000 details that photographs cannot capture. The models are useful. They are not the palace. Does preservation elsewhere soften the crime of destruction at home? It depends on what you think preservation means. If preservation means saving objects, then yes, the fragments in museums and private collections represent a partial victory. The palace's materials were not all destroyed. Some were salvaged, some were treasured, some continue to be admired. But if preservation means saving context, saving the relationships between objects and the spaces that held them, then the fragments are a bitter consolation. A carved panel in Boston is not the same as a carved panel in the room it was designed for, surrounded by matching panels, part of a coherent artistic vision. The fragments are evidence of what was lost, not substitutes for it. The museum pieces that escaped are memorials. They testify to the palace's quality, to the wealth and taste that created it, to the skilled hands that built it. But they also testify to failure. They exist because the palace could not be saved whole. They are survivors, but survival is not the same as rescue. Hamilton Palace was destroyed at home. The pieces that escaped carry that destruction with them, no matter where they end up. A panel, a fireplace, a door, each one a fragment of a story that can no longer be told complete, preserved in exile, beautiful and broken and alone. The billion-pound palace that sank. Hamilton Palace was not defeated by war or revolution. It was defeated by a choice that treated the ground as disposable. The final accounting is brutal. The palace cost the equivalent of tens of millions of pounds to build and furnish over the course of a century. It represented the accumulated wealth and ambition of one of Scotland's most powerful families. It housed a collection of art and decorative objects that rivaled royal holdings. And it was demolished for £5,000, sold as salvage to a contractor who made a narrow profit tearing it apart. The disparity between construction cost and demolition value tells the story. Hamilton Palace was priceless as a monument and worthless as a property. It had no market. No buyer existed who could afford to maintain it, in no use that justified its scale, no future that did not involve retreat and decay. The palace was built for a world that had already started to disappear by the time the last stones were laid. That world was aristocratic, hierarchical, built on land wealth and inherited privilege. It assumed that dukes would always have money, that estates would always generate income, that social structures would remain stable across generations. Hamilton Palace embodied those assumptions. It was architecture as power, a building that announced superiority through sheer size and expense. But power built on land is vulnerable when land stops being the primary source of wealth. By the late 19th century, industrial and financial capital had overtaken agricultural rents. The families making new fortunes did not need palaces. They built comfortable country houses, invested in businesses, sent their children to universities instead of finishing schools. The old aristocracy, locked into estates and traditions, found themselves holding assets that consumed more than they produced. The Hamiltons tried to adapt. They sold art. They leased mineral rights. They monetized every aspect of the estate that could generate cash. And in doing so, they hollowed out the thing they were trying to preserve. The art sales stripped the palace of its cultural justification. The coal mining undermined its physical foundation. Each adaptation brought short-term relief and long-term damage, until the palace existed in a state of managed decline, waiting for the crisis that would end it. The crisis was subsidence, but subsidence was not random. It was a choice, and the estate knew the risks. The engineers warned them, but the need for income overrode caution, because without income, the palace would fail anyway. The coal beneath Hamilton Palace was treated as a resource to be extracted, not as the literal foundation of the family's monument. That decision, made in solicitors' offices and trustee meetings, guaranteed the palace's destruction, not immediately, but inevitably. Aristocratic debt drove the timeline. The estate could not afford to maintain the palace and could not afford to stop mining the coal that paid for maintenance. The contradiction was unsolvable. Every ton of coal extracted weakened the structure. Every crack in the walls proved the engineers right. But stopping would have meant financial collapse, so the mining continued and the cracks widened, until the building became uninhabitable. Industrial extraction was the method. Coal mining in the 19th and early 20th centuries was brutal and efficient, focused on maximizing output with minimal concern for surface consequences. The companies leasing Hamilton's mineral rights followed that logic. They extracted coal where it was profitable, left pillars where convenient, and treated subsidence as an acceptable cost of doing business. The legal framework supported them. The leases were binding. The royalties were paid. If the palace suffered, that was the Duke's problem, not theirs. Legal pragmatism finished the job. When the subsidence became undeniable, the courts did not save the palace. They granted the trustees permission to liquidate it, framing the decision as fiduciary responsibility. The law protected property rights and creditor claims, not cultural heritage. Hamilton Palace had no legal standing to resist its own destruction. It was property, and property can be sold, stripped, demolished if the owner chooses. The vanity of building bigger than your future is the moral core. The Hamiltons built a palace that required perpetual wealth to maintain. They assumed that wealth would always arrive, that rents and royalties and investments would sustain their lifestyle indefinitely. When that assumption failed, they had no fallback. The palace was too large to scale down, too expensive to mothball, too specific to repurpose. It was a monument designed for permanence in a world that had stopped valuing permanence. The legacy question is sharp. If wealth can destroy its own masterpiece for one more decade of comfort, what does that say about legacy? It says that legacy is not a priority when survival is at stake. The Hamiltons did not destroy the palace out of malice. They destroyed it because keeping it meant bankruptcy, social ruin, the collapse of everything their ancestors had built. The palace was sacrificed to preserve the family, or at least to delay the family's decline. But what does it say about us when we watch the rubble with fascination? It says we are drawn to failure on a grand scale, to the spectacle of monuments falling, to the idea that even the mightiest constructions are vulnerable. Hamilton Palace's destruction is compelling because it is comprehensible. We understand debt. We understand the temptation to solve today's problem with tomorrow's resources. We understand the slow compromise that turns into catastrophe. And the palace sank because the ground was sold out from under it. But the ground was sold because the palace demanded too much. It was a building that ate money, that required constant feeding, that turned generations of wealth into maintenance costs and operating budgets. The Hamiltons built a masterpiece and then discovered that masterpieces do not pay for themselves. In modern terms, adjusted for inflation and asset values, Hamilton Palace would be worth over £1 billion if it stood today. The site alone, 12 acres near Glasgow, would command tens of millions. The structure, if restored, would be a world-class heritage site, generating tourism revenue and cultural prestige. But it does not stand. It sank, literally and financially, killed by decisions that prioritized short-term income over long-term preservation. The palace is gone. The coal that destroyed it is gone, extracted and burned a century ago. The family that built it survives, but without the monument that defined them. What remains is a story, a cautionary tale about the cost of grandeur, the danger of treating foundations as disposable, and the arithmetic that says even the greatest buildings can be reduced to salvage value. Hamilton Palace was defeated by a choice. The choice to mine beneath it. The choice to prioritize income over integrity. The choice to believe that engineering could solve what economics had made inevitable. And in the end, the palace was worth exactly what the demolition contractor paid for it. £5,000, the price of rubble. That is the £1 billion palace that sank. Not in a flood, not in a fire, but in the slow, in grinding collapse that comes when you build on a foundation you are willing to sell.